Hey guys, so today's video is an updated palette rankings video. So I'm going to be ranking all the palettes that I own from my least favorite to my favorite. I've been doing this video just about once a year, I think for the past 3 years now, so I figured it was time for an updated version, especially because I just did a big collection declutter, and I was pretty cutthroat in that declutter, so I feel like now my palette collection is a little bit more curated. I do have 22 palettes that we're going to be ranking today, and I'm counting all of my palettes with 5 or more pans. I think the fewest number of pans I have is 6 actually, and I'm not counting quads today. I thought about it, I only own 1 quad. I just feel like you can't really compare quads to full palettes. It's too hard. So in order for me to be able to rank the palettes in like a fair way, also being just slightly over analytical and nerdy, I did create a ranking system for my palette rankings. So I've done this in the past as well, but I'm doing it, I change it up every time, like how I do the system. But this time I decided to assign a score to each palette in 3 areas: color story, quality, and packaging. And in each of those 3 categories, I score each palette from 1 to 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. So for color story, I'm rating the palette based on just how inspired I feel by the color story. Do I feel like it's cohesive? I might deduct points if, let's say, I feel like there's a few shades that overlap too much, or maybe just the color story feels jumbled to me. Then for the next category of quality, I'm ranking the palettes based on pigmentation, blendability. If there's a dud shade in the palette, I do deduct a point, or if some of the shades just don't work well, or maybe they require like special treatment, I might deduct a point there. Then the third category is packaging, and I might deduct points here if, let's say, the packaging just feels flimsy, or if it feels like it might break easily, if it's overly bulky, or there's just something about it that makes it not as functional. So those are the 3 categories that I'm ranking each palette on a scale of 1 to 5. Then I'm adding those up to calculate the total score. So based on just those 3 categories alone, the maximum number of points a palette could have is 15, but then I did add kind of a bonus point option for affordability. I didn't want to necessarily let this like make or break a palette, just because, you know, some palettes might be more expensive, maybe it's an indie brand that, you know, makes that higher price worth it to me. But I did go through all the palettes and calculate the cost per shade, so I divided the cost of the palette by the number of shades, just as a way to measure the value of the palette, and I decided that if the palette's cost per shade is less than $2 per shade, then I would give 1 bonus point for affordability. I know it sounds like a lot of numbers, but I just feel like it's way too hard to look at all my palettes and just rank them without having anything to base it on. So I did want to say though, I'm wearing my number 1 palette on my eyes today, so I'd love to hear your guesses down below. Which palette do you think I ranked number 1 based on this look, and also just based on what you know? So let's hop into it. My number 22, my lowest ranked palette, is this little guy from Urban Decay. This is the Urban Decay Mini Naked Sin. This was a somewhat recent launch of theirs. They came out with a few different mini naked palettes based around one of their OG shades. This one, of course, was named after Sin, so it does have the shade Sin in it. As you can see, this is just a very neutral, basic, light, rosy toned palette, and I do like this palette. I've actually gotten a lot of use out of it since I received it. It just has a few strikes against it. First of all, there's really nothing spectacular about this formula. It's kind of just the formula that I think we've all come to expect from the Urban Decay Naked palettes. They're a little firm, a little dry feeling, but they all perform fine. I gave this a 3 for color story just because it's okay. It could have been better though, because these 2 shades right here, Sin and Unlucky, are so similar. Unlucky is just, it has a little bit of a chunkier shimmer to it, and it's a little bit more pink, like the base of it is a little more pink, but they're so similar, I just feel like they could have done something else. For quality, I also gave it a 3 just because it's very average. There's nothing wrong with it necessarily, but there's nothing great about it either. I did give it a 5 out of 5 for packaging, because I do think the packaging is really nice. Very sturdy, really pretty on the outside, and it's nice and compact. So this got a total of 11 out of 15. That is the lowest score any of my palettes got. I still like it for just day-to-day easy looks, but it's just, it's not a standout palette. Next up, for my number 21 spot, this is one that I've kind of just felt so about ever since I got it. It's the Sigma Enchanted palette. And I wanted to love this so bad because I do really like the color story a lot. I love the mix of mauves and rosy tones and some green pops in here. I think it's a really fun concept. But unfortunately, I just feel ugh, like the formula of this is just okay to me. A few of the shades, like especially some of these deeper mattes, just go on kind of patchy. They're a little tricky to work with. I also was really disappointed by the shade Cosmos here, this green shimmer. I love that there was a green shimmer like this in here, but this just goes on looking so dull and just nothing like what it looks like in the pan. A lot of the shimmers are really beautiful. I really like Plume, Budding, Electrum. Metamorphosis was also a little bit of a disappointment. It looks really pretty in the pan, but you gotta really layer it on to get it to show up. So I just wasn't impressed by the quality of this. I gave it a 3 out of 5 because I can get a really pretty look out of it. I've done a 7 looks 1 palette with this that I can link. In fact, I'll link below any videos that I've done with any of these palettes. For color story, I gave it a 4 out of 5. Even though I do really like the overall color story, I did feel like a couple of the colors, like these two right here, Claystone and Loam, we didn't need both of those. They're both so similar. One's just a little deeper than the other. For packaging, I gave it a 4 out of 5. I like the packaging, but I have found that it gets smudges on the inside really easily. Like you can kind of see down here, it looks sort of dirty. Well, maybe you can't. I definitely can in person. So I don't like that they used white for the inside of the packaging because this material, it holds on to makeup, and you're putting a brush in here, like you can see where the brush has like made it dirty on the inside. So all of those complaints aside, I am still very inspired by this color story, and I really love some of the shimmers enough that I still find it a worthwhile palette to keep and use. So next we have number 20. This is one that I've had for a long time. This is one of the oldest palettes in my whole collection, and it is none other than ABH Subculture. This was on my chopping block before I moved. I was thinking about decluttering it, but I just couldn't bring myself to declutter it. It's just such an iconic palette. The color story still, I don't find the color story as like inspiring as I once did, but I still really like it. I love the grungy vibes, and I just feel like we just moved to Seattle, and I do feel like this is a very Seattle color story. Like I'm thinking in the fall and winter, I just might find myself in the mood to use this palette again. So for color story, I gave it a 4. For quality, I gave it a 3. This palette is just tricky to work with. It's trickier to work with than any other ABH palette that I've tried. A lot of the mattes, they're kind of clingy. You know those mattes that like they just want to cling to that first spot where you touch your brush, and they don't really like to blend. And then for packaging, I gave it a 4, which is the same score I gave all of my fuzzy ABH palettes because they just stain easily and it's annoying. So that also got a total score of 11. Honestly, it was hard to decide what order to put these two in. I feel like they're about tied. But next up, we have number 19. This is another classic in my collection, one that I just couldn't bring myself to declutter because I still love so many things about it, but it's the Shared Planet Polar Bear palette. This is an indie brand. I noticed that they lowered the price on this. It used to be, I think, $48 or maybe $42, but now they've lowered the price to $32, and that's not a sale price, that's just the official price on their website. So if you've been thinking about snatching this up, it is now a lower price than it used to be. I'm not sure what that means for the brand. I hope they're doing okay. I feel like I haven't heard as much about this brand in a while, but for this palette, I do really like the color story. I feel like I haven't been quite as into super cool tones, really icy, grayish, bluish cool tones as I once was, so that's why I gave it a 4 for color story. Some of these shimmers are out of this world, especially Avalanche, but then I do feel like the mattes are just a little bit stiff. I like the mattes better than like Subculture and Enchanted, but they're still not my favorite matte formula. They're kind of stiff. It's a weird formula. They're very, like, they feel very firm. I still am able to get color payoff. I do find the matte black in here a little bit useless. Honestly, if I'm gonna use a matte black for liner or something, this is not the one I'm gonna go for. It's just not, it's not as pigmented as it could be. Packaging, I did give a 5 because I do really like it. I think it's pretty. I like the holographic design. I think it's a good size. Feels very sturdy even though it is like a cardboard material. So then at number 18, we have another palette that I feel like not a lot of people talk about, but this is from the brand Estate Cosmetics, and this is their Mystic Forest palette. I haven't loved a lot of the things that I've tried from them, but this palette, oh my gosh, I love this color story. I especially love this in the fall. This just makes me think of that classic fall day, like the leaves are all different colors, you're walking outside, maybe you've got like a sweater on, maybe you're holding a cup of hot tea, you can hear the leaves crunching underneath your feet. Like, this is a fall palette for sure, and I feel like this is actually kind of taken the place of Subculture a little bit for me. Obviously I did rank it a little bit higher than Subculture. they're similar. They're definitely not the same. This one just leans a lot more orangey and olivey, whereas this has more than just that to it, but this palette just makes me so happy. So for Color Story, I gave it a 5 out of 5. I wouldn't change a thing. Usually I like palettes with more shimmers than mattes, but with this palette, I don't know, I'm okay with it. I just like what they've got going on here. I did give it a 3 for quality. The mattes are all fantastic. I have no complaints. But the two shimmers in here, these are actually my two favorite shades, Mystic Forest and Fairy Dust. Both of those are beautiful. They kind of feel like Super Shock shadows to the touch. And you can just see they're so foiled and lovely. The only problem I have with them is that they do tend to crease. I've found better luck with them if I set my entire lid with powder before I apply them. Normally I don't do that, but I feel like it helps with those a little bit. I still get a teeny bit of creasing. So that's why it is ranked a little bit lower, but I still love the concept. I love the packaging. It also got a 5 out of 5 for packaging. So that is my number 18 palette. Look at how beautiful this packaging design is too. I want to see more like this from Estate because I feel like they've got a good thing going on here. I also really liked their Hidden Garden palette, which is in the same type, like same size palette and everything. I just didn't need the colors, so I did end up decluttering that one, but that was a really nice palette too. Alright, so next up at number 17, we have another ABH palette. This is Soft Glam. This is another one that I've had in my collection for a very long time. I think I've had it even longer than Subculture, if I'm not mistaken. This is another one that was actually on my chopping block before I moved as well, because I just felt like I wasn't reaching for it, like I wasn't using it. But in the fall I do find myself getting back into this palette. Last fall I did a 1 week 1 palette with this one and I really did like all the looks I got with it, so I decided to hold on to it for one more fall and winter to see if I hopefully end up using it more. I gave this a 5 out of 5 for quality. There are no dud shades in here. They're all great. They all work well. But the Color Story I gave a 4 out of 5 because I just find it a little repetitive. There are just a lot of mid-toned, like warm browns in here, which aren't usually my preference for matte colors to wear. And the packaging I also gave a 4 out of 5 because I don't love the fuzzy packaging, although this one I've managed to keep pretty clean the entire time I've had it. So that's ABH Soft Glam, and it's a good palette, but it's just not my favorite anymore. Next up at number 16, we have a ColourPop palette. This is their In a Trance palette. This palette was actually decluttered to me by a friend, so I don't know if I would have bought this myself, but I do really like the quality of these shades. I do think ColourPop does a pretty good job with their eyeshadows. Most of the shadows I've tried from them are really good quality, especially their pastels are surprisingly good for such an affordable brand. But for some reason with this palette, I just don't find myself reaching for it very often, but at the same time, I can't seem to let go of it because I do find the colors really fun and cute. And whenever I do play with this palette, I have fun with it. So it's not a palette I use all the time, but it's one that I'm still happy to have in my collection. I gave it a 3 out of 5 for Color Story only because I personally just don't find myself inspired to use these colors that often. And also because there's one shade in here that I don't use, the Pressed Glitter. I'm just afraid to put those on my eyes. They're not technically eye safe. I know some people are fine with risking it, but I just don't want to risk it. So 1 out of the 9 shades isn't really useful to me. I gave it a 4 out of 5 for quality because there's nothing bad about it, but there's also nothing like outstanding about the formula. And for packaging, I actually did give it a 5 out of 5 because I do really like this packaging. It's very compact, sleek, there's no like wasted space, and it's held up really well so far. Oh, and this palette gets a bonus point for affordability because the cost per shade is only $1.55 per shade. Another affordable palette at number 15. This is the most affordable palette in my collection when we're breaking it down by cost per shade, and this is the Profusion Mauves palette. I do love this palette. For Color Story, I gave it a 5 out of 5 because I think it achieves what it is meant to achieve very effectively. It is meant to be a mauve palette, and it's a monochromatic palette without there being any really overlapping shades. I think all of the shades in here serve a purpose, and even though it is all rosy mauve tones, I still find it very versatile. I think you can get a lot of different looks out of it within that mauve realm. It's not like every look I make with this palette turns out the same, and I just think there's a lot you can do. You can stay within the lighter pinks, you can go really bold with this red. That's why I gave it a 5 for Color Story. I did give it a 4 for quality. Comparing it to all palettes across the board, not taking into account the price, most of the shades in here are fantastic, but a couple of them I think could be better in terms of pigmentation. These two shades down here, Explode and Ballad, especially Ballad, they're a little sheer. I do wish there was a little bit more pigmentation to them. I do think that Profusion's mattes are kind of hit or miss, but the shimmers in here are incredible. I mean, Look at those. These don't look like they came out of a $5 palette at all. Another thing I did deduct some points for was packaging. The packaging, as you can see, the writing wears off pretty easily. It gets scratched up very easily. Packaging works. I do think I would worry about, you know, traveling with this a lot, keeping it in your makeup bag all the time. Like, it might break. You know, it doesn't feel like the most sturdy packaging, but, you know, for $5, it's really not bad. And then of course it got 1 bonus point for affordability. So that is Profusion Mauves. I think it's a fantastic palette. I do think Profusion's shadows can be a bit hit or miss, but this palette in particular is really good. For number 16, we have my other ColourPop palette. This is Miss Bliss from the same line as In a Trance. I don't think you can buy either of those anymore. I do think they've been discontinued for a while now, but this palette is super cute. I do like it more than In a Trance just because these colors are a little bit more my preference. I do love peaches and corals, especially soft peaches and corals. But as you can tell, this is very much kind of a one-trick pony kind of palette. You're not going to get a ton of variety here. There's not a whole lot of depth here, so you're really, if you're using just this palette alone, you're mainly going to be getting pretty light, peachy, pink looks. This one also does have a pressed glitter, which is another thing I deducted a point for. But overall, the quality of these shadows is nice. It does have 4 mattes with the little sparkles mixed in, as ColourPop sometimes does. I do find it a little annoying. Sometimes you can get fallout, and those shades are very, you get a lot of kick up when you dip your brush in, but at the same time they're also very easy to blend, so it doesn't really stop me from using them either. So that is ColourPop Miss Bliss at number 14. In the number 13 spot, we have one of my favorite brands for eyeshadow. This is BH Cosmetics, and this is their Lost in Los Angeles palette. So this is a very colorful, mostly pastel eyeshadow palette, and the quality of this is incredible. You'll notice all of the BH Cosmetics palettes in my collection got a 5 out of 5 for quality. They don't make a bad shade. Like, they just don't. All their shadows, their formula, they have got it down. So this gets a 5 out of 5 for quality, but for color story, I gave it a 3 out of 5 just because I find it very jumbled and kind of overwhelming to look at. It sort of seems to me like they decided what colors they were going to put in here, and then they just kind of did like a randomizer and had the shades all just kind of put in random order, and that's how they're presented here. That's just how it feels to me, but I just find it a little tricky to open up this palette and know exactly what I'm going to do, or like what kind of look I'm going to create. I find it fun when I'm doing like a palette bingo, or if I'm just wanting to kind of use one of the shades, but I just end up not reaching for it a whole lot because I just feel a little overwhelmed by it, even though I have liked a lot of the looks that I've gotten with it. I also feel like this shade, Rodeo Drive, is just a little random. Like, why is there an olivey green in here? It just feels kind of odd. For packaging, it also gets a 5 out of 5. I just love a simple cardboard packaging like this. Works great. And of course, it also gets an extra point for affordability. So that is my number 13 palette. Then in the number 12 spot, we have the Aether Beauty Desert Sunset palette. This is such a fun color story. At first glance, it might look a little bit like the ABH Sultry palette, but I find it nothing like that, honestly. Like, every look I've gotten with this is nothing like a look that I would get with Sultry. It does lean just a little bit warmer and a little bit more saturated. Like, especially the coral in here is it's like almost like a neon hot coral. It's very vibrant. So I gave it a 5 out of 5 for color story. I find this very inspiring. I love the layout of their palettes too. I know the triangular and like diamond shapes might not be for everyone. Normally I just prefer like either circles or like squares or rectangles, but I find it kind of fun. I like this slightly different style. I still find it very cohesive and like easy to look at, easy on the eyes. And I really like the mix of coral and almost olivey tones in here. I just think that's really fun, kind of unexpected. I did take off 1 point for quality because this deepest brown shade can be a little bit patchy at times, but all the other shades perform amazingly. I also really like the packaging. I like this new Aether palette packaging better than their old one with the elastic band. But yeah, this is a great palette if you like the colors. I really do think it's a good one. The cost per shade though is quite high. This is $4.80 per shade. Urban Decay Naked Sin was $4.83, which that one was the highest by far. Aether is definitely not cheap because they're really careful about where they source their ingredients. They make sure that they're not sourced from child labor conditions. So for those reasons, I think they're justified in charging a little bit more, and I really like their shadows, as you'll continue to see. And it's funny, we're not even in the top half yet, but many of these palettes that I've already talked about are ones that I recommend all the time. I really like them. Like, obviously I love the Aether Desert Sunset. I really do like Lost in Los Angeles despite my complaints. Miss Bliss I love, you know, Profusion Mauves I recommend all the time. And it's funny, like many of these palettes all scored like a 14 out of 15. So you can see how I was really, they were neck and neck, and it was really hard to rank these, and none of them had terrible scores because having the curated collection that I do now, I really do like most of the things that I own, which I think has always been the goal for me. So yeah, I think it just goes to show how happy I am with my current palette collection. So next up we have number 11. This is a cutie that I purchased this year, the Essence Coral Me Maybe palette. This is a little 6-pan, very affordable. It smells like vanilla. I don't notice the smell like when I'm applying it, but when you smell it up close, it does have a little bit of a vanilla scent, very pleasant. For this one, I gave it a 5 out of 5 for color story. I love that it's kind of meant to be a peach palette, kind of a monochromatic palette, but all the shades in here are different from each other. They don't overlap, which is good, especially for such a small palette like this. I would hope that each shade is different from the next. And to me, it's a very well-balanced color story. You have 3 mattes, 3 shimmers. They all perform beautifully. The only thing is, and I did give it a 4 out of 5 for quality, just because there's nothing about the quality here that really makes it stand out. Like, the shimmers are nice, but they're not special shimmers. They're not like some of the ones that you'll see ranked in the top, which are like out of this world, next level. It's just kind of, you know, your basic standard quality that you would expect when you see the shades in the pan, but they work well, they do what they're supposed to. The packaging is very small. I also gave it a 4 out of 5 for packaging because the writing has already started to wear off a little bit. And of course it got 1 extra point for affordability. So that is the Essence Coral Me Maybe palette. Super cute. If you like peachy tones, this is a great little palette to have. Alright, so we have made it to the top 10. We're well into the top half of the palettes. So at number 10, we have the Flower Beauty Jungle Lights palette. One of my favorite palettes. I love these little 6-pans from Flower. I hope they continue to come out with more of these because I think they've got a great formula going on here. This was the first one, and then they do also have the Desert Lights palette as well. So clearly this is an all shimmer palette, and these shimmers are all really like metallic, foiled, just super, super blingy shades. And I just love these. I think there's something very special, especially from the drugstore. Now, actually, if you break down the cost per shade for the Flower Beauty Jungle Lights palette, it's actually pretty expensive. It's actually pretty similar to like the cost per shade in ABH palettes, but the shades are special enough. I think it's worth it, and if you can get it on sale, even better. But I just think this is one of those standout drugstore products that should have more hype, honestly. But unlike the Estate, like creamy shimmers, these don't crease at all. I don't have any problems with that. I don't really get much fallout either. I always make sure to build slowly, and I like to just apply them with my finger. I love them. I gave it a 4 out of 5 for color story just because I don't really use this purple. If it were me, I would have swapped that shade out for something else. But I can understand that it might be useful to other people. Quality 5 out of 5, packaging 5 out of 5. I love this palette. Alright, number 9, we have one of my favorite indie brands. This is the CLARITY Cosmetics So Mermazing palette. This is the quintessential pastel palette. Love it so much. The shimmers in here truly make this palette shine, though the matte formula in here is not my favorite. These matte pastels, I find them a little dry and chalky, and part of that is just because they are so light. Like, these are true pastels, whereas, you know, the pastels in, say, my Lost in LA palette, they're a little bit deeper. Like, a lot of these aren't true pastels. These are legit pastels. And the peach and the yellow, they definitely do need to be layered over a white base like the NYX Jumbo Pencil in Milk. But the shimmers in here, I went through a phase like earlier this summer where I was using these shades like non-stop. This Oh Ship shade, let me just show you. That's my favorite shade in the palette. This is just one of those next level shimmer formulas. All of the shimmers are like that. I love them so much. They make gorgeous topper shades. Sometimes I'll just use one of the shimmers and no other shades in this palette just to complete a different look as a topper shade. So I love the shimmer so much that it almost outweighs my complaints about the mattes. So for quality, I did give it a 4 out of 5 just because I don't love some of the mattes, but overall it's fantastic. And the packaging, I did give a 5 as well. I just think it's super cute, pretty. It's cardboard, which I love. It's very sleek, which I love. So that is the CLARITY So Mermazing palette. I saw that they're coming out with a Halloween palette this year, and I haven't even seen what it looks like yet because they haven't actually launched it. I've just seen the packaging, but I think I'm going to be tempted by that. Number 8, we have another BH Cosmetics palette. This is the Mimosa palette. I actually just recently did a 1 week 1 palette with this guy, so of course I'll link that for you, but I had so much fun with this. Obviously this is a very specific color story. A lot of pink going on in here, a lot of corals. I have said many times before, I wish there were more oranges in here. I do feel like some of the pinks overlap a little bit too much. Like, obviously none of the matte pinks are exactly alike, but they're close enough. Kind of wish they would have left some of those out and swapped in something different. But the quality is incredible. All of the mattes perform perfectly. All of the shimmers perform perfectly. There's not a single dud shade in here. I even like the inclusion of the matte white. I found that I really enjoy using that as my inner corner brightening shade. Never would have tried that, honestly, if it hadn't been for this palette. So that is BH Mimosa. Such a fun palette. Really, it is more versatile than you might even think just looking at it. So if you like these colors, I do highly recommend it. In 7th place, we have another ABH palette. This is Sultry. This is another one that's been discontinued. And I was so excited to get this palette. I do really like it. Again, I don't have any like major complaints about it. And I have it ranked higher, of course, than Subculture and Soft Glam. But for some reason, I still feel like I haven't used this palette that much, even though I've had it for going on 2 years now. So I definitely plan on doing a 1 week 1 palette with this soon, probably closer to the holidays, because I do really think of this as a great holiday palette. It's great for year-round, but I love that it has a silver and a gold in it, lots of great neutral shimmer options, and I even like the pop of coral too. And I do, of course, like the packaging of this better than the others, just because it doesn't have the fuzzy stuff. And the glitter actually doesn't shed or anything, so I think it's really pretty. Alright, at number 6 we have a longtime favorite. This is the Urban Decay Stoned Vibes palette. If you've been here a while, you remember in 2020 this was like all I could talk about for like 6 months. This is just such a fun palette. I wish it hadn't been limited edition, because to me this is some of the best work Urban Decay has done in years, at least that I have tried from them. It's something different, something unique. It's not another naked palette. It's a new formula. I want them to do more like this because, you know, kind of like the Flower Jungle Lights, it's that kind of creamy, sort of cushiony texture. You get 8 shimmers and then 4 mattes to kind of ground the palette, but it really is a shimmer-focused palette, which I love. These shimmers are all like glimmery duochromes, really pretty. I did take off 1 point from quality just because I do find that this shade right here, Raw Energy, it just doesn't show up the way that it looks in the pan on your eyes, the same way that all the other shimmers do. I just feel like I do have to spend some time building that shade up, but all the other shades perform great, and the packaging is absolutely stunning. It's a little bulky, but I honestly don't mind because they made it so pretty. The only thing is if you like to have your palettes stacked together, the kind of gemstone part is raised, but I don't mind it. I think it is a work of art. I still love this. Of course you can't get this anymore because it was limited edition unless you're looking at like eBay or Poshmark, things like that, but this was a masterpiece. Alright, we've made it to the top 5. I'm sure those of you who know my palette collection well have already started making your guesses as to what's next. So in number 5 we have a drugstore longtime favorite. This is the e.l.f. Earth and Ocean palette. I've been raving about this palette for like 3 years now. It still holds up. It really does. And they do still sell this as well. I've tried a few of the 18 pan palettes from e.l.f. This one, Opposites Attract, and New Classics. I decluttered Opposites Attract and New Classics a long time ago, but this one has stayed through countless declutters. I don't think I'll ever declutter this. I think this is such a great drugstore palette. I do think the formula of this one is much better than a lot of other e.l.f. palettes that I've tried. It's better than New Classics and Opposites Attract for sure. The shades just have more to them. Like, they have more pigmentation. They feel a little bit softer and creamier to me. And I think the color story, absolute 5 out of 5. I love the mix of blues and then earthy tones and greens. Super versatile. Really no dud shades. I did take off 1 point for quality because these 2 light blues down here, you do really have to build those. For such an affordable palette, I really don't mind because I can still get them to show up, but all the other shades in here, incredible, especially the shimmers. I love this palette. I will never stop saying how good it is. I do think the packaging could be better. The New Classics packaging that I had did break. One of the hinges broke. This one hasn't broken on me yet, but I did give it a 4 out of 5 just because it doesn't feel like the sturdiest packaging ever. But then of course it does get an extra point for affordability. Alright, in the number 4 spot we have another high-end palette. This is another one that you can't get anymore, the ATHR Beauty Rose Quartz palette, but it is the old version. They did discontinue this version and came out with a new version, which I was really sad about because I think the old version is fantastic. This is just my kind of color story. This is like even more so than the Urban Decay Mini Naked Sin palette that was in last place. This is like the everyday soft, rosy color story of my dreams. Like I love that I don't have to think very hard. All of the colors in here, the other thing I love about it is all the colors in here, they just work so well together. They blend well together. The mattes in here are some of the best mattes I've ever used, and I don't usually care that much about the mattes. Something about these is just, they're so fun to work with because they just blend effortlessly. One minor thing that I was going to take a point away for quality, but I decided not to, is the fact that the shimmers in the middle, you do have to layer those over a glitter primer if you want to really get the full intensity, or maybe you could also wet your brush. But I honestly don't care, because when I do layer it over a glitter primer, they are some of the most beautiful shimmers I've ever seen. I did rank this one a little bit lower for packaging than Desert Sunset. Desert Sunset I gave a 5 out of 5. This one I gave a 4 out of 5 because I don't love the elastic band. I find it a little annoying. Also, the metallic details did start to get like scratched up pretty quickly after getting it, which I thought was kind of a bummer for such an expensive palette. So my number 3 is another one that's been a favorite for such a long time. It is my favorite of all the ABH palettes, and it is the ABH Norvina palette. I still think this is just such a wonderful palette. I have been trying to hit pan on as many shades as I can this year, kind of as like a low-key pan that palette, and I just love this. I feel like I really fell in love with this last year, even though I'd had it in my collection for like 3 years. Last year was just the year that I became obsessed with this palette. The shimmers in here are super special, just very foiled. They almost look like the Flower Jungle Lights shimmers, but they're more of a powder formula rather than a cream. I just think it's so romantic and ethereal with the pinks, but then you can also get a very fall look with like the burgundy, this like orangey color. There's just a lot you can do with this. My outer packaging is super gross. You can tell it's well loved, so that's the only thing I got a point taken away for, but I love this palette so much. Palette number 2 is my other Flower Beauty palette. This is the Desert Lights. I do like this even more than Jungle Lights because I use all 6 of the shades. Same formula as Jungle Lights, but this is just a way more me palette, just with the colors. They're all very rosy. I love a good rose gold shadow. You just can't go wrong with any of these shades. I even like to use the deeper shade to deepen up the outer corner. It actually looks beautiful. Even though I originally didn't think I would use that shade all that much, I think it works great as like a liner or a deepening shade. So you really can get a full look out of this palette if you want to go all shimmer. So this one got a perfect score, 15 out of 15. It's wonderful. Okay, so that brings us to my number 1 palette. I am really curious to see how many of you guys guessed it correctly. But this is another one that's been a favorite for a long time, and it is the BH Cosmetics Summer in Saint-Tropez palette. This one got the highest score it possibly could have. It got 16 out of 15 because it did get an extra point for affordability. Like I said before, BH Cosmetics shadows, they don't make a bad shadow that I've tried. And I love this color story so much because it's a great mix of bold colors, but then also more muted colors, really just my kind of palette. This is what I have on today, and I did film an Instagram reel creating this look, so you'll be able to see that up soon on my Instagram. But I used the shade Sand, which is my favorite shade, to start out the crease. And I used Cabana in the outer corner, and then I popped Beach Club all over the lid, and then I used a little bit of Coastline in the center, and then Marina I used on the inner corner. There's just so much you can do with this palette, like truly so much. I feel like even though I've done so many looks with it, I've still barely scratched the surface of like the different color combinations that you can do with this. So I think it's a great palette whether you're a beginner to colorful eyeshadows or you just already love colorful shadows. I think so many people would love this. I know BH Cosmetics has gone through a bit of a transition. I know they were bought out by Makeup Revolution, but if I heard correctly, I think they are keeping the original formula for their shadows, which is great news. So I'm excited to see the future of BH. I've been a fan of their eyeshadows for a while now. I do think they make the best eyeshadows at the drugstore, at least from cruelty-free brands that I've tried. So that is my number 1. I had so much fun redoing this video, giving you an updated version. I know a lot of these are palettes that you've seen year after year in these videos, and it's fun to see like how things move around. A lot of these though have been in my top 5 or my top 10 at least for a long time. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you've not already. Also feel free to check out the Patreon where I do post a bonus video every month if you'd like to support me over there. I'd be so appreciative. Otherwise, I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day, and I will talk to you very soon in my next video. Bye.